Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video I want to give a brief overview of Leibniz's theory of monads, which we can say is his metaphysical system, and it's one of the most unique and interesting metaphysical systems in modern European philosophy. So Leibniz starts with the thought that there are clearly objects in the world, and those objects clearly exist of smaller things. So if I take something like a pen, clearly this pen has parts, and because it has parts we can cut it up, either in practice or at least in thought, and consider those smaller parts. Now those smaller parts will probably consist of more smaller parts and so on, but Leibniz believes that this cannot go on forever in a sense. Because Leibniz tells us, when you have an aggregate, so something that consists of other things, then for its being it is dependent on the things out of which it consists. And if an aggregate, something that consists of other things, is always a dependent being, so dependent on something else, then there must also be things that are not dependent on something else, right? There must be things that just exist in themselves. And those things cannot be aggregates, right? They cannot consist of further things because then they would be dependent on those further things. And so Leibniz tells us there must be simples. That is, there must be objects that do not have parts. And if they don't have parts, then according to Leibniz, they also can't have any extension in space. Because if something has extension in space, then I can, at least in thought, think about a part of it. Let's say its left half or its right half, and then that would mean that it depends for its existence on those parts. So, according to Leibniz, just by thinking about what the world must be like in order for aggregates to exist, we can come to the conclusion that there must also be simples, things that do not have parts and that are not extended in space. And Leibniz calls those simples monads. Now, when you think about monads, Leibniz goes on to tell us, you can see that they behave very differently from aggregates. So if we wonder how an aggregate comes into existence, what we should say is that it comes into existence because all its parts come together, right? That is how this thing is combined, how it begins. Its parts come together into a pen. That's when the pen begins to exist. How is the pen going to end, right? When is it going to stop existing? Well, when it dissolves, when its parts are no longer a coherent pen-shaped whole. So aggregates come into existence and dissolve by aggregation and dissolution of their parts. But a monad is a simple, so those processes simply do not apply to it. It can't come into existence when things come together, it can't dissolve when things fall apart. So, Leibniz tells us, monads are completely immune to all natural processes of being, of beginning and ending. Instead, monads can only be created or annihilated sort of at once. And when Leibniz talks about creation and annihilation here, he's not talking about a natural process, right? This is not something that we see in the course of nature. It is something that only a divine creative being could do. A divine creative being can create monads out of nothing and maybe also annihilate them into nothing, but this is not a natural process. So we don't have to worry, if we were to worry about monads, we don't have to worry that they will ever end, for instance. And that's going to be relevant for Leibniz because it's going to turn out that you and I are not aggregates, but monads. And so we cannot stop to exist, except through an act of God, maybe. Now, if we think more about monads, we can also see that the standard natural ways that objects have of interacting cannot apply to them. Right? So this pen can interact with a piece of paper when I write on it. How does it do that? Well, some of its parts, stick to the paper, right? They leave the pen, they stick to the paper. And that, according to Leibniz, is how things interact. They either, change their parts, maybe parts of one object go to another object, or the relations between those parts change, right? Maybe I break the pen, and thus I change the relations between the parts of the pen. They used to be close together, and now they are suddenly far apart. That kind of process cannot happen to a monad because it is a simple. And so, indeed, Leibniz tells us that there actually cannot be interaction between monads. Right? They can't exchange particles or parts because they don't have parts. They can't change each other's, way of being put together, the relations between parts, because again, they have no parts. And Leibniz also thinks that it doesn't make sense to think of monads, or really in a sense maybe anything else, but certainly monads of sort of exchanging properties. Right? You couldn't have, let's say, a hot monad and its hotness sort of goes to another monad. I mean, that doesn't really make sense, right? Properties just migrating from one thing to another. So Leibniz is going to be completely biting this bullet, and he tells us that monads have no interactions. There are no causal relations between monads. Nothing from the outside can influence a monad. And his term for this, a famous term, is he tells us that monads are windowless. Right, so nothing comes in from the outside. Okay, so the story about monads is that we have these simple things. They have no parts. They do not interact with each other. There's no natural process that can create or destroy them, or change them for that matter. Well, does that mean that they are all the same? Right, that these are just featureless points? Well, Leibniz doesn't think that that's possible. He doesn't think it's possible for there to be two objects that are exactly the same. In a sense, we could say, what would make them two objects? Or, as Leibniz likes to tell us, suppose that God creates a world and there's an object here and an object there and they're exactly the same. Well, why did God create this one over there and that one over there rather than the other way around? Well, there doesn't seem to be a reason for that. Right? There couldn't be a reason for that. And Leibniz believes that everything must have a reason. That is his famous principle of sufficient reason. So that too is an argument that he brings out to tell us that monads must have properties, enough properties that all of them are different from all the others. Right? So every monad has to be unique. But what kind of properties can a monad have? Right? It doesn't have parts, it can't be big, it can't have a shape. Well, Leibniz tells us there is one kind of property that we know is always, not in a sense the property of an aggregate, but the property of a unity. And those are the properties of thought. Think about it. Suppose that I'm thinking, right? Let's say I'm thinking, the weather is nice. I'm thinking the weather is nice. Well, that's not something that consists of four parts. There's not a the thought, a whether thought, an is thought, and a nice thought. And they happen to be arranged together, and that's why I'm thinking the weather is nice. No, thinking the weather is nice is something unified, right? I mean, these things have to be together in order for them to be that thought. You can't take parts out of it. I mean, there's no thought weather is nice where the part the has sort of disappeared or something like that. It doesn't make any sense. So when we think about thought or other mental states, those are precisely the kinds of things that always have to be a unity and that don't have proper parts. And that is something that, Leibniz is going to use to tell us that we should think of monads as having, in a very broad sense, thoughts. And a preferred term for this, for Leibniz, would be perceptions. So monads have perceptions. Could be maybe something like sensory perceptions. Could be something like abstract thought. All of that falls under the idea of perceptions. So all monads have perceptions, and all monads have different perceptions. That, by the way, does not mean that all monads are conscious. So Leibniz is very careful to make a distinction between, on the one hand, perception, and on the other hand, what he calls apperception. And apperception is also in Kant, by the way, something that we can often just translate as consciousness or self-consciousness. So monads all perceive things, but in a lot of them, Leibniz tells us, these perceptions are so confused that they're not really transparent to the monad itself, you could say. It's not really aware of having these perceptions, and so it's not really conscious. And so a lot of monads, maybe, let's say the monads that are not associated with living beings, have extremely confused perceptions, and we can't say that they have some kind of consciousness. And then there are other monads, maybe monads that we associate with animals. And I'm not talking about all the monads that make up the animal body, but like the one ruling monad in which the consciousness of the animal would be located. Those monads, those animal monads or animal ruling monads, they have clearer perceptions and they have some kind of consciousness. And then there are also monads which are rational, which can think abstract thoughts, and those would be sort of the ruling monads of human bodies, or as Leibniz would say, it's the monad that you yourself really are. Right? So the idea is that you yourself are one monad, which is in charge, you could say, of a body, and we'll talk about that later. It's in charge of a body, and your perceptions are pretty clear, which is why you are self-conscious. They haven't always been pretty clear. Your monad was already existing before you were born, and it will continue to exist after you die. But in those periods of time, your perceptions will be very confused and you will lack self-consciousness. Although maybe in the fullness of time, God will, give you a body again, allowing your perceptions to become clear again. And that would be a kind of resurrection, even though you in fact never disappeared, right? Your monad was always there. So there are different kinds of monads based on the clarity of their perception, but they all perceive, even if they do not all apperceive, and they all perceive something different, so that they're all unique, and that's why they are different monads. Okay, but what do we perceive? I mean, what are the perceptions that monads have? Well, Leibniz tells us, every monad perceives the entire universe. That's not so strange, even from a sort of natural science perspective, you could say. Right? My body right now, one could claim, and certainly one could claim before the advent of relativity theory, my body right now is perceiving everything else in the universe, even if it's merely through something like its gravitational power. Right? If a rock changes position on mass, that has an influence on every particle of my body. A very small influence, but an influence. And that will be true even for things that happen much farther away. So it's not so strange to believe that everything in the universe sort of feels, in a kind of unconscious and very minor way, everything else that's happening in the universe. And that is Leibniz's view here. Every monad is perceiving the entire universe, but it is only perceiving part of it more clearly. Right? My perceptions of what's happening on Mars are extremely confused. I can't make heads or tails of them. In fact, even my perceptions of what is happening in the room next to me are fairly confused. My perceptions of what is happening here right in front of me are very clear. Okay. But I'm perceiving the whole universe, and you are perceiving the whole universe. And in that way, each of us is a kind of mirror of everything else. Right? Everything I do is in your perception. It's part of your properties. And everything you do is in my perception and part of my properties, even though these perceptions will, in general, be very confused. So what this means is that everything in the universe is extremely interconnected. In fact, I would not be me if you did not exist, or if you were different from what you actually are. Right? It is part of me that I perceive a universe in which you exist, and in which you exist as precisely the person you are. And it is part of you, of what it is to be you, to perceive me and everything that I do, even though you might perceive it very confusedly. And so one could say that when God decided to create me, this is what Leibniz could say, when God decided to create me, specifically me, not a being that looked a lot like me, but had some properties differently. No, when he decided to create me, he simultaneously decided to create the entire universe exactly as it is. The identity of any monad in the universe is bound up with the identity of every other monad in the universe. If one thing in the universe had been different, right, if one monad had been taken out and switched for another monad, then everything would have to change. Right? Every other monad in the universe would have to change. God would have had to create a different world with completely different monads. So, we may feel actually, in many daily life instances, that our identity is bound up with the things that we meet around us. Right? If we didn't know the people that we actually know, we would be different people, in big ways or in small ways. Leibniz, you could say, takes that principle to its logical extreme. Right? Nothing in the universe could be different without you ceasing to be you. And there might be someone else in your place, but it would be a different world. Right? So we are all interconnected. None of us could exist without all of the others existing. And when God decided to create one of us, he decided to create the entire world. Or rather, you could say God decides to create the whole with all these interconnected parts in one go. So, this also gives us the key to solving a big question. The big question is this. I said very early on in this video that monads cannot interact, that they are windowless. But they sure seem to interact, right? It seems as if I'm giving a talk about Leibniz's monads and you are listening to it. Well, how's that possible if I can't influence you and you can't influence me? Well, it's possible because God has created both of us and has created both of us in such a way that we perceive each other. Now, this perception is not a matter of causal interaction, right? It's not the case that I do something, there's a signal that goes to your monad, it goes in your monad, changes your monad, and you perceive me. No, because monads are windowless. Nothing comes in from outside. But monads have an inner principle of change, right? Monads are active. The thoughts that a monad has, the perceptions that a monad has at one point are perceptions of the entire universe. And this is going to generate the next perception. And that's going to generate the next perception in just the same way that a physical universe with causal interactions would go from one point to another, to another, to another. You were already perceiving me extremely confusedly before you put on this video. The moment you put on this video, you perceive me very clearly, right? You hear what I'm saying. But that's a process that's happening internally to you, right? It is your perceptions developing in the logical manner. But because you and your identity and me and my identity are completely interconnected, everything that there is to know about me is already inside of you. Everything that there is to know about you is already inside of me. And so our own internal developments can generate in each of us perceptions that perfectly align and that look exactly the same as causal interaction. Right? So again, Leibniz is taking this idea of the interconnectedness of things, right? That I couldn't even be myself if you didn't exist exactly as you are, and the other way around. He's taking that to a logical extreme and saying, well, in a sense that means that I don't even need you. I don't even need sort of influence from you because it is already in me, right? It's already the way I am that is going to involve and invoke everything that you do in my development. Often very confusedly, maybe sometimes, if we meet each other, very clearly. This idea that God creates all the monads in such a way that they fit together is called the idea of pre-established harmony. And it has often been ridiculed, maybe even, but it makes logical sense, and Leibniz uses it to solve some of the problems of causation that other philosophers of his time certainly don't have much better answers to. And I would just point out that a little after Leibniz, you've got Hume telling us that causation doesn't even exist. Well, basically that's what Leibniz is saying, but he can explain the appearances with this idea of pre-established harmony. One last thing I would like to say about that. When we think of perception, right, this central term of Leibniz, we tend to think of perception as a purely passive affair, right? You're sitting there and the world comes into you, and then you perceive things. Intriguingly, for Leibniz, perception is a completely active affair, right? This entire lecture about Leibniz, you didn't get that from me, in a sense. You got it from you. Right? It was all already there. It is your internal development that generates these perceptions. They involve me in a kind of logical way, but they don't involve me in a causal way. It was already there. As you live, as you perceive, you yourself are the development of the entire universe in a harmonious whole with everything else. So, is it true? It's very wild. There are many places at which you could resist Leibniz's arguments and come up with a different system, right? And to be honest, if what you have to say about causation is pre-established harmony, it's maybe not the best story you can tell. Also, you really require this divine author of the universe, because otherwise the story doesn't work. So there are clearly weaknesses, but it's also a fascinating system that is, in fact, I would say, a lot stronger and has a lot more positive and useful and interesting ideas in it, such as this idea of the logical interconnectedness of all things, than people often give it credit for. So, if you have some time, reading the Monadology of Leibniz, which is very short and very cool, would be a really good use of that time. Hope to see you again.